Everybody, this is Perch, and hopefully you listened to the interview with Jeff Thorne. I think it was a surprising interview because it went in a couple directions I didn't expect. But there was a couple pieces out there that were so important. I almost want to grab the audio and bring them back in, but and I probably will when I do some of this analysis. But it fits hand in hand with the sales analysis things that I know a couple people are enjoying, and I've had going up on the channels. We kind of look at where things are charting, where things are going, and what I'm about to describe is funny because I think you've got a really difficult problem that is complicated because it's an unwinnable problem in many ways. Except I also think there's a very easy solution to this, at least in the short term. And that's what we want to talk about. So bear with me here while I kind of lay out the premise. But I think this really hits on kind of the core challenge that comics has. And the more I think about it, the more I think most of the challenges all fit into the same thing. And the statement here that we're going to explore um, you know, did the direct market effectively kill comics? And there's truth to that, but it's funny because the direct market during the time period where it really got rolling helped save comics, but simultaneously put in motion the things that would help kill is all these are all very extreme words, but basically damage the comics industry in the long run. So first, how did it help comics? Because it did. The newsstand was putting up great numbers and all that is great and everything else, except there were a couple very troubling signs that if you happened to be in and around comics in the late 80s, you've heard. And I think Jim Shooter has mentioned this. A couple of people who actually have some legitimacy, who are actually doing the job at a senior level, have mentioned that one of the challenges of the newsstand was, number one, returnability was growing out of control, meaning the comics getting pulped and returned was actually growing. There were the amount was growing, and there were worrisome rumblings from the retailers, from people like Safeway and the grocery stores and the bookstores that they didn't. It was becoming too much of a turnover product. And on top of that, there was, I think, a lot of desire. The internet, and this is getting into the 90s. Things like AOL and other stuff are starting to pick up, and there were a lot of questions being made about the long-term viability of the magazine rack and the newsstand. These things were happening, and comics, somewhat by a happenstance. I mean, it. I'd love to say it was great foresight, but I think it was more accidental than anything. The direct market starts up, which is going to be, the comic shops are going to take a bigger risk for a bigger cut, and it was going to be able to curate this hobby, this industry, into a specialized store. And if you look at the 90s and even the 2000s, specialized stores were in vogue. They were picking up from everything from kitchen equipment to comics. And this wasn't a bad thing. And in many cases, it helped transition a lot of these products into places where they could be better, could be a little bit more quality, could expand the market, could open up the world for a lot of indies, lots of things. The direct market were very, very positive. However, the side effect, which ultimately is very detrimental to comics, is that the direct market ensured that the customer base for comics, the people who wanted to buy comics, were people that already knew comics existed. They were people who set out to the comic shop as a destination. They weren't just wandering down the street and like, hey, what's this mysterious store? Let's go in here and see what they have. Oh, it's comics. I've always wanted to get into that. I think I will buy them. That scenario doesn't happen. So when you had comic shops, and comic shops were by nature of a very heavy volume. I mean, one of the disadvantages comic shops have to say, like kitchen equipment, places like Sur La Table or places, like that, is the stock that you're keeping on hand is way more, like dramatically more. You have back issues, you have new issues, and you have that same turnover problem that a lot of the grocery stores and bookstores were complaining about. But comic shops still did well because there was this kind of infusion of geek culture. You had, X-Men #1 selling, millions of copies. you had simultaneously this weird shift and change in bookstores. You have places like Walden Books and B. Dalton's, which are big chain bookshops, struggle, and they kind of gave way to the Borders and Barnes and Noble, the bigger bookstores. And one of the things that the bigger bookstores did is have a much more limited comic section. They never really stepped into quote unquote the newsstand. They went for graphic novels. They went for things that weren't going to be such a turnover. And so suddenly you had this gap where collectors were, by and large forced to go to the comic shop in order to get what they wanted, because mail order subscription services were never very good. And that gave comic shops a little bit of extra life. But again, like we talked about in the interview, and I think this is the most important point because this touches on all kinds of things, cultural, business, everything, is you had what was the newsstand was most good for was getting people who didn't know comic books existed or were new to comic books or maybe heard them and never tried them, give them a way to discover them. That's, you walk into a gas station, a grocery store, a bookstore in the mall, wherever it happened to be, and there's comic books sitting on the shelf. Kids are looking for something to be entertained by, and they pick up the comics and they read them. And that desire from new readers is still there. And that's why you see places like Walmart and Target. And it's weird, even grocery stores. I was in the grocery store yesterday, and what is there in the tiny little magazine stand in their tiny little book area? You don't think about buying books in the grocery store, but they have this tiny little section with toys and other things that, is designed to appeal to, let's say, 5 to 10-year-olds. And what is sitting there on the shelf? Dogman. Freaking Dogman's in the grocery store. It's everywhere. And sure enough, there's a kid, even in the time of COVID, sitting on the tile floor by himself. I don't know where the parent went, reading Dogman. And that is what the newsstand did. You have, anyone who grew up in the 80s knew that if you went to a gas station, a grocery store, whatever, you would see kids sitting on the floor reading these comic books while their parents shopped. And those kids would grow up, they would go to comic shops, they would want more and more comics. Eventually they'd find their way to comic shops and they'd become collectors. And that's the market that exists today. And today, in current times, there is no newsstand, so there is no kids or new audience discovering comics that will one day make their way to a comic shop. So that is where, when people say the direct market is killing comics, it's less the direct market. It's the absence of the newsstand and the fact that new comics are only in the direct market that is killing comics. That is the problem. So, but there's another side effect here, and this is the one that there's so many arguments online, so many debates over social engineering and changing the characters and everything else. And you'll hear lots of creators and companies, editors and others, talk about, hey, why should how is a new comic fan going to care about George Perez Titans? That was an awesome storyline, but how are they even going to care about that? How are we supposed to get a new fan to get excited about the Great Darkness saga of Legion of Super? How? Like, that's not going to happen. And hey, what's going to appeal more to a new comic reader? Is it, Clint Barton, who's gone through like 5 or 6 evolutions of his character, was killed by the Scarlet Witch and came back and it's been all kinds of random things? Or relatively fresh, new, shiny Kate Bishop, who's younger, probably same age, maybe even looks or sounds like some of the comic readers that are new, that could be customers? What should we do? Should we try and push old man sloppy, messes things up Clint Barton, or Kate Bishop? And if you're a Disney executive, or you're an executive at Marvel, you're going, this is an easy answer. We want to appeal to new audiences. We want to appeal to kids. We want to get people into comics. We need to give them characters that they can relate to. Throw in Kate Bishop, throw in Miss Marvel, throw in America Chavez, throw in all these things. But here's the rub. That sounds like a fine idea. Why not? I would argue with one little point as a sidebar. When we were talking, in the 70s, when we were attracting fans into comics, and you had, Wolverine and Nightcrawler and Colossus and Storm. I don't know. Were there a bunch of American kids out there who were really wanting to see, they were Russian descendants and they wanted a Colossus-like character? Were there refugees from Kenya hanging around in Safeway wanting to see themselves in a book and were excited to see Storm? I don't think it's not as one to one, I think, as people tend to map it today. I mean, yes, I do think kids wanted to see a male character, female character, white character, black character for sure, but they weren't getting into all like today. The list of specifics is way more complex than it needs to be with what kids are after. I'm seeing some breakdown of okay, yeah, we do have a Miles Morales, which is going to appeal to maybe a young black teen, male fan. But what about the young male black teen who lives in Miami rather than New York? Does Miles? We need somebody who's going to appeal to Miami black teens instead of New York black. It's like, oh my God, no kid thinks that way. You're out of your mind. You're going too far. At any rate, that's a little tangent. The problem that we have is that this idea of, hey, let's get some new characters in the mix, let's put them out. Great, we'll get this new audience, all genders, all ethnicities, super. But where are you selling them? You're selling them in the comic shop. And who's the clientele of the comic shop? The clientele of the comic shop are people who were kids in the 80s and the 90s who are now collecting comics because they've stuck with it. And they are looking for Hal Jordan and Wolverine and Hawkeye, Clint Barton. They are not looking for Kate Bishop. They don't want Kate Bishop. If they want to accept Kate Bishop, they don't want Kate Bishop pushed on them because Disney's trying to appeal to a kid who won't be excited by Clint Barton but would be excited by Kate Bishop, except the comic buying audience has grown up with Clint Barton and doesn't want him disrespected. It's funny because sometimes that audience, that quote unquote older aging comic audience that goes into shops is described as out of touch and all the rest, but it's not. That audience is more than happy to accept new characters. They have in the past, they have for decades. But what they get upset about is when they perceive that you're disrespecting the characters that they grew up with. It's like the Iceman situation. X-Men fans have been okay with gay characters for that it is ridiculous to say that a hardened X-Men fan will reject any gay characters based on the type of book. I mean, if that's true, then that customer, that fan, has not been reading X-Men, because a lot of the whole nature of what's going on in X-Men is tolerance and accepting people different from what you are. But what they will get upset about is when you say, hey, person who's been reading the comics for 50 years, now the character is gay. Surprise. And by the way, if you don't like that, you're a bigot. That is going to make people insane. It's going to make them angry, and frankly, rightfully so. You're talking about an audience that you, meaning DC and Marvel, curated. They made this audience. They spent decades building this audience. And then in 2015, if they suddenly turn around and say, yeah, we don't want this audience anymore, we want a new audience, piss off, you're old and dying anyway, we don't care about you. Like, what are you doing? It is absolutely absurd to spend all this time building up a market at a very specialized store that you sell exclusively to, only to then turn around and say, you're not the audience we really want. We want a really different audience. And by the way, why aren't our sales higher? I mean, come on. I think that Miles Morales and Kate Bishop and all these newer characters Marvel's created can definitely find a home with new readers. I think they absolutely can. But those new readers are not going to the comic shop. You're going to have to reopen the newsstand. You're going to have to get these, or you're going to get digital or whatever. You're going to have to go make a partnership with Nintendo to get your comics going onto the Switch. Whatever it happens to be. But you can't be surprised that your brand new characters, which in many cases, and here's the funny part, a lot of publishers and creators will say, oh, we're not disrespecting Legacy. We're not disrespecting it. We're just changing it utterly, or removing it, or canceling the titles that had it and introducing new characters and saying they're way better in every way. But we're not disrespecting Legacy at all. We're just we're just completely erasing it. It's fine. As you can still find your characters there and back issues, or hey, look, there's a backup story in this one comic where Clint Barton is a sloppy idiot, and Kate Bishop has to save his butt. See, if you're a Hawkeye fan, he's still there. What are you complaining about? You're very disingenuous if you are surprised that that's irritating people. I'm just saying. So what's the solution to all this? Well, there's a couple, and it was all in what I said. Number one, you got to get comics more places than the comic shop. You absolutely do. You have to build this new audience, and unfortunately, it took like 40 years or more to build up a consistent newsstand audience. And now you're almost starting from zero. The brand recognition is still there, but you're almost starting from zero. So that's number one you have to do. And you have to do it tomorrow, like or today, this afternoon. You have to do it right now. You have to start. Number two is you got to stop disrespecting the audience that you built. This is the key. Comic publishers, you built the audience you have. You made it. You can't pee on it. Those people are willing to spend money. They're willing to put, dollars on tables for your books. Yes, you do have to give them a little bit of what they want. Not a ton. Here's the crazy part, Marvel. For example, Marvel, you publish 80 books a month. Okay? You're telling me you can't publish 5 books? You're telling me, like we said in the video, you're telling me you can't go dial up Claremont and Byrne and say, hey, will you produce one X-Men book? Keep in mind, that audience was perfectly happy buying Uncanny X-Men, only one book. Back in the 80s, there were not, you had New Mutants join the picture eventually, and then X Factor, but for a long time, you had one X-Men book. You don't need to make 20 X books for this audience. Make one good one. And then if that sells really well, make 2. And then continue your experiments with all the new stuff you're doing with Reign of X and all the rest. Be my guest, but put out one book that's going to appeal to that nostalgic crowd. You're telling me out of 80 books you're publishing a month, you can't do one? That's, in many cases, that's all people are asking for. You don't have to convert over your whole line. Just make one solid, appeals to that audience. If you don't know how to appeal to that audience, go hire creators who know how to do it. Here's a crazy part that I learned from Jeff Thorne last night in the interview. He gets it. I think if you said, hey, Mr. Thorne, we want a book that is going to appeal to comic collectors in the 80s, that's going to respect what they love about comics, that's not going to introduce a bunch of crazy new characters or anything else, that really goes with the classics and gives them good, compelling adventures that they can read and sink their teeth into. I think he could write that book. After listening to him last night, I'm convinced he could do it. I think there are plenty of people who could do it. So pick, of your 80 books a month, pick 5. Do a Spider-Man book, an Avengers book, an X-Men book, and then I don't know, 2 others. Fantastic Four, Thor, sure. Just pick 5 and put those out. And they are marketed and intended for the audience you built for 30 to 40 years, and they will sell well. And then, by all means, continue to do Marvel Now, Marvel Different, these new characters. Do that too, because you should win in both areas. You have to win it. You can't just do all your line for, the older comic collector crowd. Absolutely not. But what you can do, again, if you were publishing 5 books a month, this would be a way different discussion. And we'd be like, oh, okay, what do we want to do here or there? Way different. But when you're publishing 80 books a month, you have room in your publishing schedule to have a little bit of each play going on simultaneously. And that's how you win. And that's how you solve this problem. But anyway, fascinating discussion. If you haven't listened to that interview, please do. I could talk a lot more on this subject and will. But it was, to me, it encapsulated really a lot of the problems. We'll talk more about how that scenario I just laid out over the last 20 minutes really continues to haunt us with all kinds of things, with characters, with creator fights, with social media behavior, with random relaunches, all this stuff. It all is in many ways linked, and I think the more people fight about it, it's stupid because there are very obvious solutions. Anyway, what do you think? Interesting, not interesting, off base. There's a lot of nuance. You can pick it apart, the argument, that's fine too. But hey, if you enjoyed it, leave a comment below. Would love to know your thoughts, your feelings. Subscribe to the channel. That would be awesome. Growing that subscriber base every day. It's growing very fast now, which is weird, but wonderful. Thank you. And I need to come up with something funny. Like smack that like button, like Hank Pym smack. No, I should no. Never mind. No, start. Sorry, no. Just like the video if you like. There you go. Thanks for listening.